Elaborating the relationship between libido development and cultural evolution is the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis. It has a long history of creative empirical research, bold speculation, brilliant insights, and errors of majestic proportions. In the previous 2 lectures in this series, I put forward a stratigraphy of concepts that I will now recapitulate from bottom to top briefly. Charles Darwin's speculations on the evolution of Homo sapiens, their social instincts, and their cultural evolution provided the foundation for Freud's reconstruction of the social life and of our prehistoric ancestors. Darwin wrote, quote, "The most probable view is that primeval man originally lived in small communities, each with as many wives as he could support and obtain, whom he would have jealously guarded against all other men. Or he may have lived with several wives by himself, like the gorilla. For all the natives agree that but one adult male is seen in a band. When the young male grows up, a contest takes place for mastery, and the strongest, by killing and driving out the others, establishes himself as head of the community," unquote. Freud accepted Darwin's speculations and added to them. For Freud, in our dim prehistoric past, humans lived in small groups under the domination of a strong and despotic father who kept the females to himself. He expelled the sons who wished to overtake him and possess the women. The sons banded together and killed the father. This occurred countless times and became part of our phylogenetic memory. After the murder of the father, the brothers renounced full instinctual gratification, acknowledged the rights of the others and their obligations to one another. They created the origins of religion, specifically totemism, in which the dead primal father was worshipped and mourned as an ancestor spirit in the form of an animal or a plant. Fundamental to totemism are exogamy and totem worship. In exogamy, marriage outside the clan, incestuous wishes, the incestuous wishes is denied, and the totem animal or plant becomes sacred, must be protected, and it is only killed and eaten in some cultures as a sacrament. The totemic feast suggests the cannibalistic feasting upon the body of the murdered father. The early religions were characterized by great mother goddesses, and later still by great mother goddesses and their sun god consorts. After time, the mother goddesses receded and the sun gods gained in importance. With the sun gods came the emergence of the mythology of the heroes and dying gods, and the beginning of the patriarchal era of the god kings and the king gods. Freud was building a schema of cultural evolution from the patriarchal horde to the totemic brother clan to the religious world to our modern scientific Weltanschauung. What he was addressing here was the phylogenetic origins, the prehistoric cultural origins of the Oedipus complex. But Freud, Ferenczi, and others made the critical error of assuming psychological Lamarckism, the idea that experiences are genetically inherited by subsequent generations. Rohan, however, offered a more compelling understanding of persistence of certain beliefs and attitudes. He said they are based not in the remembrance of shared phylogenetic experiences, but in our ontogeny. Because we have a long period of dependency on our mothers and fathers and form deep attachments, we are vulnerable to a reliable set of traumatic experiences that recur all around the world and throughout time. When a culture has a uniform approach to rearing children, the traumas become more reliable and the strategies for dealing with them become institutionalized as myths and cultural characteristics. With psycho-Lamarckism thoroughly rejected and the recurrence of symbols and complexes attributed to ontogenetic experiences rather than phylogenetic experiences remembered, the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis came to something of a halt. But there remained something very compelling about Freud's totem and taboo, and this was the set of analogical relations he had established between myths, rituals, cultural development, psychological development, and psychopathology. Freud had linked the Oedipus complex and its related psychopathologies with our prehistoric past, totemism, and the ritual of the totemic meal. Only a genius could have generated such a compelling vision. Then in the 1960s, John Weir Perry, using the outdated ideas of psycholamarckism and Jung's archetypal theory, put forth his ideas on the myth and ritual correlate to the brief psychotic disorder and its relation to the birth of civilization, or of the urban revolution, you could say. Perry would explicitly deny psycho-Lamarckian explanations of the relation between the individual and cultural evolution, while at the same time implicitly drawing on them. He would recognize the parallels and claim to not understand the mechanism of transmission of such ideas like sacral kingship from a culture to an individual. Nonetheless, Perry's contribution is a significant one that recognizes the metaphors embedded in myth and ritual as the most distinctive points of correspondence between the individual and the culture. This was actually an idea first presented by Freud, but Perry made such a much tighter one-to-one connection, and in doing so gave us a point of reference and a method to further elaborate the relationship between libido development and cultural evolution. In my work with the autistic boy, whom I presented in the second lecture of this series, I used Perry's model, and without knowing the errors of my ways at the time, I also assumed psycho-Lamarckism and archetypal theory. Though I changed my theoretical orientation from Jung to Freud many, many years ago and developed a more sophisticated understanding of the symbolic function and the transmission of symbols from prehistoric cultures to modern-day humans, the analogical relations that Perry and I identified, I find, are still quite useful in pursuing the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis. Based on Perry's work and my own, we're now able to construct the following schema, where we see infantile autism in a way, you could say, again, the point of connection is the metaphors. Infantile autism associated with early infancy, with the myth of death and rebirth, the funerary ritual in the Upper Paleolithic. The brief psychotic disorder with adolescence, the myth of sacral kingship, the ancient New Year's festival, and the birth of civilization, or the urban revolution. It's another term for it. The urban revolution, the birth of city-states. And with these 2 points in the spectrum of cultural history established, we are also in a position to ask, what were the, quote, spiritual, unquote, developments in cultural evolution between the Upper Paleolithic and this birth of civilization, or the urban revolution? And in what way are they related to the stages of psychological development between infancy and adolescence? As a side note, I should add that I have no personal interest whatsoever in formal religion, but professionally speaking, find that the spiritual developments in cultural evolution are of primary significance in both our cultural evolution and in that aspect of our psychological development, which is embedded in language, customs, and tradition. In Freud's psychosexual schema of development, he presented us with a set of behaviors, dynamics, and bodily preoccupations associated with the development of the libido. He named these stages after the predominant erogenous zones involved: the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic stage, the latency phase, and the genital stage. In Erik Erikson's psychosocial schema of development, he presented us with a set of social conflicts and interpersonal dynamics that run parallel to the stages of libido development. He named these stages not as anatomic sites, but as interpersonal conflicts of one quality versus another. Thus we have trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, etc. In what I will call my psycho-spiritual schema of development, I will present not a set of bodily preoccupations or interpersonal dynamics, but rather a set of metaphors created in the dialectic of libido development and cultural evolution. Each stage will be represented not by an erogenous zone or interpersonal conflict, but by a cluster of metaphors. If the term psychosexual pertains to the threshold between the psyche and the body, and the psychosocial pertains to the threshold between the psyche and body in interpersonal relations, then the psychospiritual pertains to the threshold between the psyche and body in interpersonal relations and projected, so to speak, on the walls of the universe. The psychospiritual, in my use of the term, is above and beyond anything else about metaphor and meaning making. It is the way we transfer our psychic experience into the world in the form of our beliefs about nature, society, religion, spirituality, and the way we come to terms with our place in the universe. Before getting into the 4 stages of psycho-spiritual development and the metaphors associated with them, I would like to provide a quick trip through time and the evolution of Homo sapiens, drawing attention to the physical origin of the universe 13.7 billion years ago, the physical origin of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago, evidence of life on Earth 3.8 billion years ago, first mammals 290 million years ago, earliest primates 65 million years ago, and the chimpanzee 6 million years ago. We have the first hominids branching off of the chimpanzee tree, probably somewhere between 6-7 million years ago. And we see the Australopithecines, kind of like Australopithecus afarensis, the famous Lucy fossil, emerging 3.9 to 3 million years ago. We see the Homo line emerging about 2.3 million years ago with Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago. And then, as I said in the previous lecture, we have the first funerary ritual 90,000 years ago. And then we see an absolute explosion that takes place about 50,000 years ago in the Upper Paleolithic, when we have the funerary ritual, ritual cannibalism, amulets, skull worship, and the statuettes of the female body and cave art, all emerging in the Upper Paleolithic. The Neolithic, about 10,000 years ago, we see sacrifices, permanent houses, pottery, domestication of plants and animals, clay mother figurines, the bow and arrow, and other extraordinary innovations of the Neolithic revolution. In the High Neolithic, 7,000 years ago, we find large earthworks, mounds and valleys that are dug by humans, large stone monuments, metallurgy, and the emergence of the storm gods. With the birth of civilization, otherwise referred to as the urban revolution, 5,500 years ago at the earliest, it took place at different times in different places. We find writing, the invention of the wheel, the calendar, kingship, city-states, occupational specialization, large-scale organized warfare. Now, so what might we imagine about early Homo social organization and psychic structure? It's hard to say, but in a rather recommendable book, Demonic Males, Apes and the Origins of Human Violence, 2 primate researchers, Richard Wrangham and Dale Peterson, draw together their findings along with other research studies in order to make some very educated reconstructions of the nature of early hominid social structure. They explain that Charles Sibley and John Alquist discovered that chimpanzees and humans share 98.4% of their nuclear DNA, and that gorillas share only 97.9% of their DNA with chimpanzees. In other words, chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas. So if chimpanzees are so closely related to us, Wrangham and Peterson suggest, closely related to us, Wrangham and Peterson suggest that one might imagine that our common ancestor looked like a cross between a chimp and a human. But they quickly discount this possibility because they note that, one, humans are a relatively fast-changing species evolutionarily. Through our history, our evolutionary history, we've changed very, very rapidly. And two, that chimpanzees and gorillas look very much alike, indicating that chimpanzees are relatively slow evolving species. They have changed very little over a very long period of time. If gorillas branched off the ape lineage 10 million years ago, and chimpanzees and humans separated a mere 5 million years ago, and chimpanzees and gorillas look so much alike, perhaps our common ancestor with chimpanzees was chimp-like. Then Wrangham and Peterson asked, so what did it look like? A chimpanzee, they replied. And sure enough, in September of 1994, a new species of woodland ape, Ardipithecus ramidus, was discovered in Ethiopia and dated to 4.4 million years, older than Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis. It is anatomically between a chimpanzee and an Australopithecus afarensis. Subsequent to Wrangham and Peterson's work, other ape-like creatures with hominid features have been identified and dated to between 5.2 and 7 million years ago. Wrangham and Peterson say that if our hominid line is a radical evolver, changing rapidly, a radical evolver in that it has evolved rapidly through numerous species during the last 5 million years, and that the chimpanzee line is a conservative evolver, which has changed little during more than 10 million years, then perhaps we can look at the behavior of modern-day chimpanzees as a good model for our earliest ancestors. Chimpanzees show affection with a pat on the hand, a kiss, or an embrace. They develop lifelong friendships. They can do low-level addition and speak in sign language, make and use primitive tools, hide their feelings, hold grudges, and even bring rival chimpanzees together in order to make them end their rivalry. If this weren't enough, they are also known to grieve for their dead babies by carrying them around with them for days or weeks at a time. But Wrangham and Peterson are even more impressed with the nature of chimpanzee society. They write, quote, "The social world of chimpanzees is a set of individuals who share a communal range. Males live forever in the groups where they are born, while females move to neighboring groups at adolescence. And the range is defended and sometimes extended with aggressive and potentially lethal violence by groups of males related in a genetically patrilineal kin group. What makes this social world so extraordinary is comparison. Very few animals live in patrilineal, male-bonded communities, wherein females routinely reduce the risk of inbreeding by moving to neighboring groups to mate. And only 2 animal species are known to do so with a system of intense, male-initiated, territorial aggression, including lethal raiding into neighboring communities in search of vulnerable enemies to attack and kill. Out of 4,000 mammals and 10 million or more other animal species, this suite of behaviors is known only among chimpanzees and humans. It suggests that chimpanzee-like violence preceded and paved the way for human war, making modern humans the dazed survivors of a continuous 5 million year habit of lethal aggression, unquote. Wrangham and Peterson. Chimpanzee males are always striving to be king of the mountain, top of the heap. They form male-bonded units of cooperation and coordination in territorial battles, but ultimately even such male-bonded units are organized on the basis of the perceived superior strength of the individuals. This, of course, sounds quite similar to, and only a little different from what Darwin speculated over 130 years ago. Thus, while some of the basic behaviors essential to the Oedipus complex are genetically embedded in the social instincts of the chimpanzees, the Oedipus complex probably could not manifest itself until the Upper Paleolithic, when our extraordinary symbolic function achieved its current level of sophistication and gave personal and social meaning to male dominance, the jealous guarding of females, male bonding, and the avoidance of inbreeding. What I'm saying here is that contrary to what Freud speculated, the Oedipus complex did not evolve in human culture. Its dynamics evolved in the chimpanzee line of evolution, were passed off to the hominid line, and when Homo sapiens' extraordinary symbolic function became established, the Oedipus complex emerged in cultural and psychic structure. Around 4 million years ago, our ancestors became bipedal. During the Lower Paleolithic, between 2.6 and 100,000 years ago, our ancient ancestors began fashioning stone tools, and brain size expanded with almost every new evolutionary advance. Controlled fire use began 380,000 to 465,000 years ago, and the earliest evidence of intentional human burial with tools, grave goods, and/or indications of ritual are found in the Middle Paleolithic 90,000 years ago. It was in the Middle Paleolithic, the stone tools that were being fashioned were in many ways fairly crude, and they had what was called the Acheulean hand axe. This was a tradition that lasted probably literally hundreds of thousands of years without stop. And you find it in cultures all around, where basically people had stones and a certain level of psychological capacity, and they reliably made pretty much the same thing. Here's an example of an Acheulean hand axe. This is about 100,000 years old, so they say. And this was a very typical kind of tool that was made for literally hundreds of thousands of years, starting probably in the Lower Paleolithic and moving well into the Middle Paleolithic, and beginning to fade out somewhat in the Upper Paleolithic as newer tools were developed. In the Paleolithic, however, we find people become more refined and their skills become more refined. And this is a little stone spear point or knife, something of this sort. This is from Paleolithic Venezuela. It's probably about 12,000 years old. Now, in the Upper Paleolithic, the brain size and mental capacities of Homo sapiens appear to have reached modern proportions. In fact, a case could easily be made for the assertion that our brains have not physically evolved in any significant way for the last 50,000 years. In the Lower and Middle Paleolithic, stone tools like this Acheulean hand axe were effective but somewhat crude. In the Upper Paleolithic, stone tools became increasingly more refined, as did the minds of their creators. Homo sapiens were hunter-gatherers who lived a nomadic life, building temporary shelters, following the herds of animals, ripening foods, changing weather patterns, and their curiosity. Modern humans emerged in Africa 200,000 years ago, and through their migratory spirit and extraordinary adaptability, they soon began spreading out and peopling the world. religious life emerged in full force in the Upper Paleolithic with the traditions of the funerary ritual, ritual cannibalism, the use of amulets, and the worship of animals, such as the cave bear. The Middle Paleolithic saw also, the Upper Paleolithic also saw the emergence of cave painting and mobiliary art. The two major themes were animals and the naked female body. Embedded in these emerging cultural phenomena are the echoes of orality. It is not that all Paleolithic cultures are oral cultures, or that there weren't any anal or phallic or genital dynamics embedded in the Paleolithic, but rather that the earliest spiritual concerns of human culture were parallel to the earliest psychological concerns of the infant. They were the spiritual or psychological birth, they were embodiment, they were incorporation, and so on. The oral stage, of course, is named after the oral orifice, which Freud identified as the primal site of libidinal gratification for the infant. The infant engages in pleasurable sucking at the nipple, thumb-sucking, eating, making gurgling sounds, cooing, mouthing objects, inhaling, exhaling, burping, and engaging in mouth play. The infant also engages in the oral aggressive activities of biting, chewing, spitting, and pursuing the cannibalistic sexual aim. It is through the oral incorporative mode of existence and participation in the world that the infant gets to incorporate the world and at the same time is incorporated into the world. Orality is the bodily metaphor pertaining to the infant's incorporation of the world and the infant's incorporation into the world. The oral stage is the personal, psychological backdrop that helps shape the spiritual and social life of our Paleolithic ancestors. Freud had said that the deeds of our ancestors in our prehistoric past were repeated so many times they became phylogenetic memories, but Rohan was able to point out Freud's error and offer an alternative explanation. Rohan began with Freud's observation that the typical traumas of childhood generate various fantasies and psychopathologies, and then added that when a homogeneous culture has a stable tradition for child rearing, the group will end up sharing some typical traumatic experiences, and as a result will join individual fantasies into a myth of the group. Rohan was referring to individual cultures, but for our purposes, I am extending this formulation to an entire culture form, the Paleolithic. And without going into the details of this funerary ritual or that, I'm simply recognizing the recurring features which Homo sapiens invented and then embraced as a way of dealing with the traumas of facing death, being, and non-being. They were traumas that inherently engaged and stimulated oral dynamics of incorporation, embodiment, and their opposites. In other words, the earliest stirrings of religious feeling, social structure, and technology in the Upper Paleolithic were not only positive assertions of a developing culture, but a sense of defensive strategies against the overwhelming terror and divine awe with which our Paleolithic ancestors met the world. The factors stimulating terror and awe in the Upper Paleolithic were not new, but Homo sapiens met them in a new way, owing to a dramatically expanded capacity to symbolize, represent, experience, and speak about their world. On the negative pole was the terror of being, but on the positive end was the awe in being and knowing it. The spiritual innovation of the Paleolithic was the notion of the spirit or soul, an abstract entity inside the person that lived on beyond death and warranted funerary rites, including the provision of food and tools and magical gestures. It was related to orality by way of the first meal and the last supper, and perhaps even more so by the first breath and the last breath. Our Paleolithic ancestors were apprehending the miracle of existence and the terror of non-being with a fully equipped symbolic function and few defenses. The funerary rite became a comforting defensive strategy for meeting death, the loss of a loved one, and the terror of being. This was probably also the beginning of the myth of death and rebirth. The abstraction of a spirit or soul existing inside a body also made it possible to socialize the act of eating so as to partake of the spirit in the totemic meal, as well as in ritual cannibalism, which antedates even the ancient funerary rituals. The spirit or soul is also a part of a new tradition in the Upper Paleolithic in which amulets were prepared and worshipped. These amulets may have been animal skulls, jawbones, soul stones, or pieces of human bone, especially from the skull. Again, the idea is that the soul or the totem or ancestor resides within. The Upper Paleolithic was a cultural explosion that gave rise to new technologies of more refined stone tools, bone tools, and no doubt other technologies and materials that have long since perished. The Upper Paleolithic also witnessed the first artistic expressions, which have been preserved in Africa, Australia, and most notably in the caves of France and Spain. These paintings are to a great extent images of animals, and whether they were painted as a part of hunting magic or worship of the totem or for some other reason, there can be little doubt that the representation was identified with what it looked like. There was a relationship between the image and what the image represented, just as there is between the word and the thing it signified. So once again, we are back to the abstraction of the soul. And one could easily add here Freud's commentary on the omnipotence of words, because this, again, the word came to represent not only the object, but a power to influence that object. The other frankly startling innovation of the Upper Paleolithic was the sculpting of small, naked, human, female figurines. It is hard to know what to say about them, except that there are many of them. Their breasts, hips, and bellies are typically large, and they give a motherly impression. As hunter-gatherers, our Upper Paleolithic ancestors would not only be impressed by death and loss, but also by the birth and the food that sustains life. With improved, yet still quite limited technology, our Upper Paleolithic ancestors were, like infants, at the mercy of the Great Mother, Mother Earth, Nature. Oh, sure, they were fierce hunters, taking down cave bears, mammoths, giant sloths, etc. Yet still, they were at the mercy of nature to provide the food. And sometimes she did, and sometimes she didn't. Were times of plentiful food and times of famine experienced as logical, impersonal, climactic events? I doubt it. No, they were probably conceived as in some way related to early infantile experiences at mother's breast, experiences of pleasurable satisfaction and distressing hunger. And so it is, in this way, that the experiences on the oral stage of libido development, embedded in the psyches of our Upper Paleolithic ancestors, became engaged in the efforts to come to terms with their natural environment, social environment, in developing technology. The result was a set of spiritual innovations, myths, rituals, metaphors, which entered language and formed the bedrock of social structure and psychic structure as we know it today. The religious, social, and now I'd like to talk about the Neolithic and the anal stage. The religious, social, and technological innovations of the Paleolithic drew inspiration from the oral dynamics of the individual and gave them social expression. Okay, you got that little piece there? This is a sort of a key link here. The religious, social, and technological innovations of the Paleolithic are deriving their inspiration from the oral dynamics of the individual and gave them social expression. They were positive cultural assertions and socially sanctioned defensive strategies. Similarly, the religious, social, and technological innovations of the Neolithic drew inspiration from the anal dynamics of the individual and gave them social expression. In the anal stage of development, the cathexis, or focus of attention, shifts from the mouth to the anal sphincter without abandoning the oral erogenous zone. That is to say, the anal sphincter takes primary importance without the mouth losing its ongoing significance. In the anal stage, the 1-year-old toddler is learning to walk and talk. The neurological pathways between the central nervous system and the anal sphincter become established, and toilet training becomes possible. Without sphincter control in the oral stage, the release of feces and urine takes place whenever and wherever the urge presents itself. But in the anal stage, the mother, by attending to the baby's needs for a year now or more, appeals to the baby to release the bowel movement, not here, but there, and not now, but then. This is generally perceived as a bit of a shock and leaves the toddler with 1, the option to ignore potty training, remain in the oral stage; 2, the option to control the bowels and urine, but release them not when mother wants them, but when the toddler wants to release them; and 3, to win mother's love in a new way by giving her the feces or urine where and when she wants them. This negotiation between mother and toddler to manage toilet training is one in which there develops a differentiation between the passive and the active, the inner and the outer, the here and the there, the now and the then. The anal sphincter defines a limit which declares interiority and exteriority, but the toddler has to determine who is in control of this portal, me inside or someone else outside. Thus, anality is a bodily metaphor pertaining not simply to the nascent alienation of the subject from the world, as in the oral stage, but to the establishment of a power dynamic between them. It pertains to the dynamics of dominance and submission. It has to do with control and loss of control. The nascent subject, still a victim of its overwhelming helplessness, struggles valiantly to declare itself by controlling the retention and evacuation of its personal products: urine, feces, flatus, touches, gazes, and vocalizations, presenting them as love offerings or delivering them as warheads. While feeding is seen as the stage upon which the oral drama takes place, toilet training is said to be the center stage for the anal drama. Anal dynamics attach themselves to time and money and cleanliness. The anal expulsive character disregards time, spends money irresponsibly, and is messy. The anal retentive character is prompt, careful, with money, and fastidious. Anality is about establishing boundaries between self within and other without. And the Neolithic was about establishing boundaries between the community and between the community within and the wilderness without, between culture and nature, the known and the unknown, conscious and unconscious, order and disorder, cosmos and chaos, us and them. And how did our Neolithic ancestors establish such boundaries? Well, for one, they ended their nomadic lifestyles. They built year-round homes with permanent walls and built permanent walls around their villages as well. They built gardens and domesticated animals within circumscribed limits. They built walls around their campfires, transforming them into ovens. The ovens transformed clay into ceramics, and the main items they constructed with clay were pots, cups, containers. Inside the homes, families were transforming. Inside the families, individuals were developing. Inside the village walls, elaborate culture was evolving. Our Neolithic ancestors, by creating boundaries to contain themselves, fashioned a cultural uterus and gave spiritual birth to them. themselves. The Neolithic began about 11,000 years ago, which is not to say that it began everywhere at the same time. No, in fact, there were a fair number of Paleolithic peoples living their Paleolithic lifestyles up into the 20th century, and Neolithic peoples as well. When we examine the houses of the Neolithic, we discover how the people often buried the dead directly under the floors of their houses. But as we follow this tradition through time, it becomes more and more common to not only find the dead beneath the floor, but to discover that the dead are actually human sacrifices, making us wonder if the earlier finds might also have been sacrifices or had a sacrificial significance. 11,500 years ago, the early Natufian communities in Israel and Jordan built permanent roundhouses. A stone hearth was set at the house center, or perhaps at the side, and not incidentally, infant and child burials were often discovered below stone slabs under the floors. Also at Aenon, a roundhouse 5 meters in diameter was discovered. In a tomb beneath the floor were the skeletons of a man and a second person, probably a woman. These are only two of many such examples. Examining the house-building rituals in modern and ancient but historic time, Lord Raglan discovered that the Arabs east of the Dead Sea pitched their tent. When they pitched their tent, they would sacrifice a sheep to send away evil spirits. When a cathedral was built in Shanghai, the city council required human bodies to be buried under the foundation. When the Tonappu of central Silesia finished building a temple, a person is sacrificed on the ridge of the roof, and the blood is allowed to flow down on both sides. When a chief or a great man among the native people of the Canadian Pacific Northwest built a house, captives and slaves were killed and the house posts planted on their corpses. The Chibchas of Peru have what is called the Palace of the Bogota, and it is said to be built on the bodies of maidens. In Africa, when an Ashanti town was to be built, a princess was covered in gold dust, dressed beautifully, and sacrificed. Her body was then buried in front of the gates of the king's palace. French peasants sacrifice a cock when they move into a new house. And there are legends of human sacrifices at major buildings in Wales, Denmark, Thuringia, and Serbia. Mircea Eliade, a religious historian, wrote, quote, "To last, a construction, whether it be a house, technical accomplishment, or spiritual undertaking, must be animated, that is, must receive both life and a soul. The transference of the soul is possible only by means of a sacrifice, in other words, a violent death." During the Upper Paleolithic, a group of our ancestors in Meyendorf, Germany, killed a reindeer, opened its thoracic cavity, placed a large rock inside, and sunk it to the bottom of a lake. Subsequently, at Stellmore, 2 more deer were found with stones in their thoracic or abdominal cavities. During the Mesolithic period, about 10,500 years ago, and at the same Stellmore lake bed, 12 more complete reindeer skeletons were found, each of which had been submerged into the lake with stones in their thoracic or abdominal cavities. In addition, an additional 30 skulls and miscellaneous bones and large stones were also found, giving the impression there may have been 45 sacrifices in this lake. If the funerary ritual was about humanity joining the spirit, the sacrifice was about humanity saying to the spirit, "Let's make a deal." No longer at one with nature, humanity makes a deal with the spirit, its own spirit, which it has projected into the wilderness along with other aspects of itself. The sacrifice strikes a deal between humanity and the spirit and fortifies the separation between the two. If sacrifices were present in the construction of houses and in hunting magic, one can be sure they would have also been involved in ensuring the fertility of the crops. With stable year-round living sites, trade also became necessary in order to acquire food, ornaments, and raw material only available at a distance. Trade instead of skirmishing, became a new way of managing territorial boundaries. And not to say that they stopped skirmishing, or we stopped skirmishing. And not unlike sacrifice, it was an arrangement in which one gives something in exchange for something else. While the mother figurines of the Paleolithic continue to be present in the Neolithic sites, they appear more frequently as figurines made of fired clay. They also begin to appear in the form of a motherly figure with an animal or with a young boy. When we consider the anal stage toddler, we are considering someone who is also interested in control. Our Neolithic ancestors were also interested in control, but this is not to say that they were toddlers. No, they were fully integrated communities which included infants, children, adolescents, adults, and the elderly. Their sudden interest in control was due to the fact that their technology had evolved to the point that they were able to take more control over their lives than they had in the Upper Paleolithic. And when they met the limitations of their evolving technology, their spirituality evolved and sacrifice came into being. The toddler soon discovers that the feces are powerful objects of great interest to both the toddler and others in the toddler's world. Freud writes, quote, "In reality, wherever archaic modes of thought have predominated or persist, in the ancient civilizations, in myths, fairy tales, and superstitions, in unconscious thinking, in dreams, and in neurosis, money is always brought into the most intimate relationship with dirt." Unquote. Indeed, the alchemists say the philosophical gold resides in the manure pile, and it's a common expression to say someone is filthy rich, or that we don't want his stinking money. Tales tell of the goose that laid the golden egg, the ass that defecated lumps of gold, and similar such stories. Ferenczi writes, quote, "The excrementa thus held back are really the first savings of the growing being, and as such remain in a constant unconscious relationship with every bodily activity or mental striving that has anything to do with collecting, hoarding, and saving." It is difficult to say when money came into being, but it is well known that some Neolithic peoples have used cowrie shells or pearls as money, or have traded certain raw materials as units of value. There may have been limited trade in the Upper Paleolithic, but trade increased significantly during the Neolithic, when 1, technology became more elaborate, 2, people stopped moving around as much as they had when they were nomadic, and 3, people began to collect things and amass wealth associated with their more sedentary or settled life. Thus, in the Neolithic, we find a cultural definition of limits, a power struggle between what is inside and what is outside, a give and take at the level of sacrifice, reminiscent of the deal every mother strikes with her child in toilet training. Make this renunciation and I'll give you something in return. Put the fecal stick here and you get approval. And then there's the involvement with clay, in which we all recognize the sublimation of anal interest. Our Neolithic ancestors were not anally preoccupied, anal expulsive, or anal retentive, but their anality became engaged in their changing lifestyle and new technologies. And as it did, building rituals and sacrifice became the corresponding ritual, and one might assume myths of the separation of opposites, that is the expulsion from paradise, for example, became the mythic correlates. The High Neolithic and the Phallic stage. The next cultural stage is the High Neolithic, from about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. Again, these dates usually are referring to the earliest manifestations of these, the Paleolithic, Neolithic, High Neolithic, etc. There were High Neolithic cultures, you could say, that were existing up until modern times. It was at It was a time when Neolithic settlements grew dramatically in size. Metals were smelted, metal tools transformed agriculture and warfare, and large masses of people, perhaps slaves, were put to work on ambitious projects, building man-made hills and other earthworks, building large temples and setting up massive phallic stones as religious monuments. Fertility continued to be a great concern, but emphasis was shifting further and further away from Mother Earth's bounty and deprivation to ways in which to control that bounty. The strategies continued to be religious, relying on sacrifice, but there was increasing attention to the phallic powers of the metal plow in the farmer's hands and the storm gods of the sky who brought thunder, lightning, rain, and sunshine. Looked at from a distance, the High Neolithic was anything but pastoral and sedate. It was intense, ambitious, energized, and poised between the ancient traditions of the nutritive and fertile mother goddess and the powerful and fertilizing paternal sky gods. In other words, it was about the Oedipus complex. In libido development, the phallic stage is when the site of libidinal gratification shifts or expands from the anus to the genitals. The child becomes increasingly aware of genital sensations and demonstrates a genuine curiosity in his or her genitals and the genitals of others as well. Children at this stage are becoming aware of gender and generational differences. Their curiosity leads them to ask questions and make comparisons. There also arise fantasies concerning the gratification of genital wishes directed toward one of the parents and the corresponding rivalry with the other parent. The phallic stage is a bodily metaphor pertaining to the socialization of the subject. Socialization begins at birth with the naming of the child, and it continues by means of feeding, weaning, and toilet training practices, wherein the transmission of many cultural and familial attitudes toward the body and the established social system are non-verbally communicated. In the phallic stage, however, the Oedipal child becomes a speaking subject mediating the maternal ground of bodily experience and the paternal surround of culture by way of a previously established set of signifiers, that is, by way of language. Thus the child becomes socialized as a little boy or a little girl and learns to relate to girls, boys, men, and women differentially. In learning the social implications of gender and generational differences as taught within the family, the child becomes socialized. When I link the High Neolithic with the phallic stage, I do so on the basis of the ambition evident in both, in the shared interest in phallic imagery, and in the way this culture form situates itself between the goddess and the god, and the way the child situates him or herself between the father and the mother. In Ohio, Illinois, Mississippi, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, and Alabama, we find large earthworks, earthen monuments, which required great social organization and tremendous effort by many people over long periods of time to build these temple mounds, which had no direct economic return. In Cahokia, Illinois, for example, there is a rectangular flat-top mound on which a temple or a chief's house might have been erected. It is 200 by 300 meters at its base and over 30 meters high. At Moundville, Alabama, there are 20 such earthenworks, including one that is 17 meters high. The Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is 4.5 to 6 meters wide, 400 meters long, and shaped like a snake. Large stone monuments, for whatever reason they may have been built, are found in Polynesia, Japan, India, in Malta, Bulgaria, Portugal, the northwest coast of France, Germany, Denmark, England, Scotland, Italy, Scandinavia, and Ireland. Menhirs are typically large, long, uncut stones, but in northern Italy there are menhirs with incised images of axes, daggers, and men driving cattle that are pulling plows. In Corsica, menhirs have crudely carved faces at their tops, and daggers or knives carved in the middle. One is impressed at the way these menhirs, dolmens, and tombs are referred to not only as burial sites, but as cult centers, requiring highly organized and large numbers of people to construct these architectural wonders, which were then actively used for centuries and perhaps in different ways for millennia. After the intentional burials and funerary rites of the Paleolithic and the sacrifices of the Neolithic, we now come to the cults of the dead, perhaps intertwined with fertility magic. What we have here is a layer cake of religious ideas, and the new big idea in the High Neolithic is the increasingly important role of the phallus in fertility, and perhaps even a father god or sky god. In fact, it may well be that humanity achieved its sexual enlightenment in the Neolithic with the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals, or perhaps even more so in the High Neolithic, when the father's role in procreation was identified and the phallus rose to extraordinary significance. A Neolithic and High Neolithic site at Windmill Hill had over 1,000 years of occupation, from 5,700 to 4,000 years ago. It included a large earthwork ditch and hill 300 meters in diameter. 2 children were found buried in the outer ditch, along with a variety of objects, including carved phalli. The most famous megalithic monument in the world is the extraordinary circles of stones known as Stonehenge, which is generally thought to be some sort of prehistoric temple or religious center. Stonehenge is actually a site which was in active use, construction, and development from about 4,800 years ago until about 3,500 years ago. It has also been discovered that at Stonehenge and at various other High Neolithic and early Bronze Age stone circle sites throughout Britain, the stones have been set up in a way to align with the rising and setting of the sun and the moon on specific days, such as the equinoxes. In other words, in addition to worshiping the fertility of the earth, our High Neolithic ancestors were also beginning to pay attention to the fertilizing role of the sky, the sun, and the moon. Another site not far from Stonehenge is the Cursus. It is an earthwork bank and ditch in the shape of a stretched rubber band, 800 meters long and 90 meters wide. There are a number of such earthworks in southern and eastern England. Atkinson suggests that their purpose is unknown. Purpose is unknown, but their unusual shape suggests that they were ceremonial or religious enclosures intended perhaps for processions or for ritual races connected with honoring the dead ancestors. In the Neolithic and Paleolithic, the Paleolithic hearth was transformed into an oven for cooking and a kiln for firing ceramics. In the High Neolithic, it was further improved, allowing our ancestors to heat up specific rocks to very high temperatures, and in doing so, to smelt copper ore, bronze, iron, silver, lead, tin, and gold. When we reflect on the godlike technology of smelting metal ore, the increasing control our High Neolithic ancestors had over their crops, and the domestication of animals, the massive efforts required to construct long barrows, round barrows, earthworks, dolmens, and cromlechs, and to erect menhirs, we are impressed with their burning ambition. Thus it is not difficult to imagine the cursus being used for ritual races, as Atkinson has suggested. Ambition and competition? What was it all about? Was this a competition between man and nature for mastery of the world? Between Mother Earth and Father Sky for the fertility of the crops and livestock and the people? Between the son and the father for the possession of the mother? Between the young men for the love of a young woman? When we try to determine the provincial associated with the High Neolithic, It is less clear than it was with the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, but it seems likely that it would involve the erection of phalli, as we see in tree worship, fire lighting rituals, commonly associated with the myths of the theft of fire from the gods, and ambitious competition, as seen in ritual contests. These three naturally remind us of maypole rituals, which celebrate the maypole as phallus and symbol of fertility and the competition and conquest of spring over winter. But similar themes are associated with harvest rituals as well. One could recount many examples from recorded history and contemporary celebrations that could all be good educated guesses, but we cannot really know for sure. Nonetheless, I tend to think that the struggle to raise the phallus, the theft of fire, and the ritual contest, modeled after the mythological cosmic conflict, would be central themes. They all reflect a ritual contest, a heroic striving for a treasure hard to attain, and an ambition to take something and make it one's own. The birth of civilization and the genital phase. The genital phase begins at puberty, when the young adolescent begins developing secondary sex characteristics, undergoes dramatic physical changes resulting in the adult physiognomy, and enters into new sorts of love relations with peers. It is a time when the previous stages of libido development are reworked to some extent in the wider social setting. The reworking of the phallic stage dynamics hopefully include two significant differences from their original resolution. One, the love object has shifted from an incestuous partner to a non-incestuous peer. And two, the adolescent is capable of a more altruistic and tender love than is the young child whose love is incorporative, possessive, and exploitative. The integration of the previous psychosexual stages into the genital stage has its emotional intellectual correlate in the development of what Erikson described as identity. Identity, is important to remember, is not a little point deep inside a person that says what he or she really is. Identity is more like a thread that surrounds and loosely ties together some of the person's memories, beliefs, hopes, intersubjective relations, and identifications with the most important relationships in the person's life. These identifications and internalizations then crystallize into an identity. It must be restated that we are now returning to the formulations of John Ware Perry, who identified analogous links between the birth of civilization, the myth of sacral kingship, the ancient New Year's festival, the visionary experience, and the brief psychotic disorder. Perry never addressed the final natural link to the corresponding stage in normal development, adolescence. It was not a part of his work, but in speaking with him personally, he confirmed this link, or at least could see my point. The adolescent, with world-reforming idealism, does something similar to the visionary and the psychotic. He or she sees in metaphor a grand world view and a place for him or herself within it. If the adolescent cannot link this idealism with real work and a real relationship, the idealism remains naive. If the psychotic cannot see the personal implication of the world destruction and world renovation delusions, the psychosis continues. But if the delusions and hallucinations become linked to real work and real relationships, they transform, in a sense, into visions. The visions of the architects of civilization, of the urban revolution, introduced ideas such as the relationship between the God-King and the King-God, and the notion that the plan of the kingdom would be patterned on the plan of the gods. All around the world, visionaries at the birth of different civilizations and in different times imagined a balanced, fourfold world of the gods, and they built their earthly worlds along the same lines. Innovations such as the written word, the calendar, occupational specialization, city life, and large-scale warfare changed the lives of people once and for all. And one of those changes was the beginning of recorded history. The myths of sacral kingship and the ancient New Year's festivals include little speculation, as these myths and rituals are described in writing. Through Perry's work with persons undergoing brief psychotic disorders and his study of history, comparative religion, and mythology, Perry discovered that the delusions and hallucinations of psychotic patients sounded very similar to the central images and themes in the myths of sacred kingship and the New Year's festival. These images and themes are, as I said before in the second lecture, the center, death, return to beginnings, cosmic conflict, threat of the opposite, apotheosis, sacred marriage, new birth, new society, and a quadrated world. One might even say that the vision of a new society corresponds to the adolescent's arrival at a career choice or direction, philosophy, religion, or political position, and that the sacred marriage corresponds to the establishment of a sexual identity. Perry found these images and themes recurring in the narratives of many of his patients and in the myths and rituals associated with the birth of 16 different civilizations. It is my own observation that these themes also correspond to adolescence, and by extension to Freud's genital stage and Erikson's stage of identity versus identity confusion. So what we end up with is a developmental schema describing the relationship between libido development and cultural evolution. This developmental schema is not experienced on the skin as a psychosexual development or in the interpersonal world as a psychosocial development, but is projected onto the impersonal surround of nature, politics, the environment, religion, and, so to speak, onto the walls of the universe. It pertains to how we make meaning of our world, our universe, and our place within it. I call it psychospiritual development or psychocosmic development. These are unfortunate terms, as they have colloquial connotations that imply the mystical or religious, which I repudiate. And yet at the same time, they are probably the most appropriate terms in that the psychospiritual implies the interface between the psychological and the spirit or meaning-making, and the psychocosmic implies the interface between the psychological and the order we make of the universe. The psychospiritual or psychocosmic stages of development are not defined by a single word, such as the oral stage, or by a tension, such as trust versus mistrust, but rather by a cluster of metaphors. These clusters are indefinite and could be elaborated extensively, but we might begin with something that looks like this. And the clusters of metaphors for the first stage might be something along these lines, where we see death is, I preference it as some kind of an organizing metaphor of the whole stage, but we see the images of oneness associated with the oral stage, with the upper Paleolithic, the myth of death and rebirth, the funerary ritual, the mother goddess, link it to narcissus and narcissism, Erikson's stage of trust versus mistrust, and begin to play with all of these images of unity. Unity of soul, spirit, demon, anima, the soul within the amulet, with cannibalism, with the mouth, with swallowing, orality in general, the ancestor spirit, hunter-gathering. There's a kind of a chaos. The hunter-gatherer lives at one with nature, is moving within nature, as opposed to separating himself off in the next stage. So we see images, not only unified images such as paradise and bliss and oneness, but also unifying images such as suffering and hell and thirst, hunger, and darkness. In the second stage, I call separation, we think of two-ness. The psyche is being split into opposites. And here again, we see the anal stage, the Neolithic, the myth of the separation of the opposites. We might begin to think about myths of the expulsion from paradise or the end of some sort of primordial bliss. And we see the metaphors associated with it. being the house, boundaries, limits, the fence, the pot, mortar and pestle. Weaving emerges in the Neolithic, and all through cultures all around the world, weaving is commonly associated with time. We talk about the fabric of time. We talk about the three fates. One is, the three goddesses. One measures the thread of time. One spins the thread of time, one measures it, and one cuts it. And it refers to spinning the thread of a life, deciding how long that life will be, and cutting it. Everywhere in the Neolithic we find the arts of pottery and weaving coming into ascendance here. A third stage, conflict. I mentioned before that these stages are fairly indefinite. One could easily argue that no, conflict isn't the proper word for all of it. It should be ascension, or it should be the phallus, or it should be struggle, or something like this. But I chose these words, and then I present a cluster of images. And here again we have these phallic images, the stone monuments, pillars, the trees, all sorts of tree worship, fire, metallurgy. This is all has a very strong phallic component in all of this. And I suspect it's very intimately related with hero mythology of, fighting the dragon, overcoming the obstacle. If you can imagine thousands and thousands of people pushing, a large rock and bringing it to some open plain and raising it up. You don't do that very passively. You don't look at your watch and determine how long you're going to work this day. You have to do this with tremendous force, tremendous ambition, knowing that it's for something very, very important. And I think it was for setting the world right against the forces of deterioration. And the fourth stage, transformation, forness, identity. Here again we have writing the calendar, vision, order, cosmos, the ordered world, marriage, things of this sort. Now, after identifying these four stages of psycho-spiritual or psychocosmic development, I discovered that creation myths, initiation rites, and the origin of fire myths often recapitulate these four stages described above. The following are two short examples. In a Mesopotamian creation myth, Marduk, the hero, is in battle with Tiamat, the primeval waters. Tiamat rushes at Marduk with her mouth open and is about to consume him when he suddenly sends the evil wind into her mouth, causing her body to grossly distend. Marduk then shot an arrow into her mouth, which cut her insides and tore her belly and pierced her heart. She dies. He splits her in two to create the sky and the earth. He then drew blood together and caused bones to be and created man. So he's creating birth. In homage to Marduk, a sanctuary was built with a stage tower as high as the waters of Apsu are deep. So there's a memorial of the great big phallic tower to him. And it was then declared that that is Babylon, the place that is your home. Babylon, of course, is the city, the cosmic order on earth. In a Boshongo creation myth of Zaire, they say that in the beginning the world was dark. Everywhere there was water. And Bumba was alone. Alone, dark, the water, it's all unitary. So when you think about that first stage. Then one day Bumba felt a pain inside, and lo and behold, he vomited up the sun, which spread light across the world and dried up much of the water so that the reefs and sandbanks became visible. Then Bumba vomited up the moon and the stars and many animals and finally man. We have a birth theme coming up here. After that, Bumba's three sons finished the world. The world completed, Bumba went and showed the people how to draw fire out of wood. Okay, so he's teaching them how to bring fire out. Then Bumba strolled around through the villages and said to the people, "Behold these wonders, these belong to you." So it creates the world as it is now. And what might the utility of such a schema of psycho-spiritual development be? The most obvious utility is that it attunes us to the metaphors embedded in our patients' dreams, fantasies, narratives, and free associations. And as such, it is a way of informing our listening and contextualizing it in terms of libido development and cultural evolution. It helps us to do away with psycho-Lamarckian thinking and understand the origins of the so-called universality of symbolism, narcissism, castration anxiety, the Oedipus complex, and so on. It helps us to see that while we inherit DNA genetically, we inherit culture through the metaphors embedded in language, customs, knowledge, and technology. Freud, in describing his phylogenetic fantasy, wrote, "If the prehistoric and ethnological material on this subject is worked over psychoanalytically, we arrive at an unexpectedly precise result, namely, that God the Father once walked upon earth in bodily form and exercised his sovereignty as chieftain of the primal human horde until his sons united to slay him." For Freud, the primitive impulses are the repeated experiences of our ancestors left behind in the structure of our modern minds. When we do away with psycho-Lamarckism and take into consideration the findings of modern primatology, we can see that our primitive impulses are not so different from those of chimpanzees. The critical difference is that in addition to having impulses and social structures very similar to chimpanzees, Homo sapiens also have an extraordinary symbolic function that allows us to make meaning of those impulses, inhibit those impulses, and in doing so, elaborate culture. Thus, it is not enough to say that God the Father once walked upon earth in bodily form and exercised his sovereignty as chieftain of the primal human horde until his sons united to slay him. No, he is still alive, and still alive in the not so deeper recesses of our souls, and unfortunately, still walks upon the earth in bodily form and exercises his sovereignty as gang leader, crime boss, or totalitarian dictator over the human hordes that accept and support his supposed godhood, his narcissism to the point of apotheosis, or are oppressed by them. And these would-be gods will remain in power and continue to walk upon the earth until such time as the people unite in brotherhood and take them down.